From Rhythm and Light in Chicago, I'm Steve Ordauer, and welcome to Rhythm of Life. Today, guest host Bob Hercules sits down with the prolific author, journalist, and filmmaker, Alex Kotlowitz. Alex is best known for his books exploring the intersection of poverty, urban violence, and race, which includes his landmark book, There Are No Children Here, which came out in 1992, and his newest book, An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago, which just came out this year.
Welcome to the show, Alex.
Thanks for having me on.
You know, I've read all your books and I've listened to your radio shows and everything, and I started to realize, obviously you were trained or you had a lot of experience as a journalist, which is great, but I actually think of you as a storyteller. I wonder if you could talk about that. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, no, it is actually. In fact, for many years, when people would ask me what I do, my kind of glib response to them would be, I'm an author or a journalist, but really what I am is a storyteller. Having said that, in these days and times, I am really honored to be considered a journalist.
Yeah, we need journalists.
But no, you're right. It's what I love to do is to tell stories. I think look, as a kid, I grew up, my dad was a writer, and right. I just grew up in a household of books, and I love film. And the beauty of stories is that they let you find your own way. Nobody's yelling at you, nobody's lecturing you, nobody's pandering you, and it's also this really kind of cheap way as a reader or as a viewer of a film to sort of find your way into places you otherwise would never venture, and to spend time with people you otherwise would never meet.
Right.
And I love nothing more than a good story. And of course, the other part about storytelling is the kind of centripetal force of storytelling is empathy.
Yes.
And God knows we are so lacking of empathy in these times. And it's also the centripetal force of community. It's kind of what holds us together, what connects us. So I love telling stories.
Did you find your way to, like, you started out, I know we'll get into your story in a second, but, you came from organizing to eventually being a journalist, somewhat accidentally perhaps. But then at some point, did you find your way from being like a traditional journalist into storytelling, and how did that happen?
I began at an alternative newspaper, so I was never kind of, I ended up at the Wall Street Journal for 10 years, but even there I was kind of a non-traditional Wall Street Journal reporter. Mm-hmm. But, I started a small alternative weekly, and it was there that I realized, man, this is what I wanted to do. I was able to craft these narratives for this weekly newspaper, and I had to push myself to go spend time in these neighborhoods, communities I otherwise would never have spent time in. I think left to my own devices, I would just hole up in my house. And so the other thing I love about this work is it forces me out into the world.
So it pushes you. It's not your natural inclination, it sounds like.
No, in fact, it's really hard. I'm working on a story now, and like that, those first phone calls are so hard to make because, you're sort of worried that you're going to get this proverbial door shut in your face. And I keep on reminding myself, I've been doing this for 40 years, that, that's the worst thing that will happen is somebody will say, I don't want to talk to you. Yeah. But it's hard. Yeah.
I want to go back and just to get a little bit of your backstory so we understand where, what led to this. I know you grew up in New York. Yeah. Your father, as you said, was a kind of a famous magazine editor and writer. He wrote some books as well. Your mother, I guess, was a social worker.
Right.
And she was pretty prominent as well. So what was it like to grow up in New York with these two pretty important parents?
Yeah. So my mom actually, my dad was, he, as you say, he worked at magazines and then found his way into public television and wrote these novels on the side. And so I think through osmosis, I, got the best of him. And my mom she actually went back to school when we were in high school to become a social worker. So, and she carved out this really incredible career working at a city college, working with these first generation college students. And so I got the best of her as well.
Yeah.
But I grew up on the west side of the city of Manhattan, which at the time was really different from what it is now. It was really integrated neighborhood by race and by class. And because my dad was writing on the weekends, my brother and I had to spend all our time out of the apartment. We had
he didn't want you in the.
We had a small apartment. We had to get out of there. So I would spend my weekends playing basketball. Oh. And so and I grew up in this environment where I was hanging out with kids of different races, of different classes, and you sort of you assume this is how everybody grows up, and then you get out into the world and you realize how extraordinary it was in some ways. And so that, and also I think I was really influenced by the times. It was the 1960s.
Yeah.
And it was in the zeitgeist. I mean, you couldn't not be talking about the place of race in this country. Of course, we had the war going on. And so it politicized you. I was, I'm from 64. So growing up I was in my early teens in the 60s, and so aware, not fully engaged in all that. But I remember going to the anti-war rallies, and so it's sort of, you realize you, on the one hand, love this country, and one of the things you love about this country is in some ways, given all its flaws, is that you're able to stand up and try to make some difference and voice
protest if you need
to. Yeah. And then when I went off to college, I actually wanted to be a biologist. It was my love. I loved, and then I took
biologist.
Really? Yeah. Okay. But I took organic chemistry and realized I was not cut out for the sciences.
Not going to happen.
So I kind of got depressed. I dropped out of school for a while, and when I ended up in Atlanta working, I was on my way down to New Orleans to just see if I could find a job, and met this Episcopalian minister in Atlanta who had opened a settlement house in the south side of the city in this neighborhood that was the second poorest census tract in the country, second to Watts, and ended up spending close to a year there working as a community organizer, working a lot with kids, organizing around welfare rights and housing issues.
How did you learn to be an organizer? Did he train you or just threw you into it?
I learned there. But, it wasn't something I was really cut out for. I mean, it was a transformative year, and I loved that. My time down there, exposed me to the profound poverty in our cities. That it changed me. There's no question about it. But I also realized I wasn't cut out for that life as a kind of political activist.
What did you take away from that, though? Because I know you probably know I made a film about community organizing, the story of Saul Alinsky, and even me as the kind of outside observer when I filmed those training sessions and went on the streets with the organizers, I learned personally so much. I think in some ways it was the most profound, for me personally, film I've ever made, because I learned so much about organizing, which I found to be a very universal tactics. I wonder what you learned from organizing.
Yeah, so, a couple things. One, I worked a lot with kids there, and so I think for me it kind of reinforced the capacity of people to change. I was working with young kids, and I stayed in touch with many of them and saw them change, some for the better and some for the worse. But then with the organizing, there was a kind of irreverence about it that I really admired, that I don't find easy. And these, especially these women, when we were organizing around welfare rights, when we go down to the State House, I just admired their ability and capacity to sort of stand up and look they're basically their enemy in the face, and confront them and do it in a way that didn't feel in all threatening, but felt like, you need to talk to me, you need to answer
give me respect.
And so and it's funny, years later when I was in Michigan working at this paper, I worked a lot with Michael Moore up in Flint when he was doing his alternative paper. And I loved working with Michael. I really admired him. And one of the things I admired was, again, his irreverence. I couldn't match that. He
has a real gift for it, obviously.
This is Michael Moore. I am here to make a citizen's arrest of the board of directors of AIG.
Congressman, trying to get members of Congress to get their kids to enlist in the Army and go over to Iraq.
It doesn't come to most of us.
Governor Snyder, I got some Flint water for you.
We're actually here to make a citizen's arrest.
Speak to my supervisor.
In the white shirt, blue tie.
That's it.
Receding hairline.
But when I was community organizing, I realized the power of just sort of standing up for, ultimately what you believe. It seems so simple in some ways.
I know that organizers used humor a lot from when I had done my film,
Right.
because it takes the boss down a notch.
Right.
It's kind of a labor
Right.
organizing technique,
Right.
frankly. And I think it's a helpful technique to do that, to use humor. But you're saying it doesn't come to you naturally. You don't.
I get angry. When there are things that anger me in the world, it's hard for me to maintain that kind of sense of humor, and so I really admired it, especially among these women. That they just. They did it with a smile, and I'm not sure I could have done that with a smile.
Right.
Yeah.
Why did you get out of that? You only did that for a year, but it obviously made a big impact on it. Why leave community organizing?
Right. Well, I went back to college. I got real politically active.
You went to Wesleyan.
I went to Wesleyan, yeah.
Right.
But again, I'm not cut out for that kind of public sphere, know. And one of the things that, in the end, that I love about what I do now, and again, I found it accidentally, is it pushes me out into the world on the one hand, but on the other hand, I also spend all this time by myself.
Right. As a
writing.
writer must.
Yeah, and it's a mixed bag, but there's something that I really enjoy about that solitude, sort of working through things. I wasn't cut out. When I was in Michigan for a while, when I was freelancing, I had to take all these odd jobs, and for a while, one job I took was I worked as a campaign manager for a friend who was running for county commissioner, and I hated the job. I hated it. He won, but I hated the job.
You realize, these are things you learn about yourself in your 20s.
You had to call people, ask them to vote for them, or ask for money, and I just wasn't. I wasn't cut out for it. Yeah.
You ended up in Lansing, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
How did you end up there?
When I graduated from college, I was somewhat without a compass. I ended up working on a cattle ranch for a year out in Oregon.
Cattle ranch?
Yeah.
Wow.
And then after we rounded up the cattle, I saw an ad in Mother Jones magazine for an associate editor at a small alternative newsweekly in Lansing, Michigan. And I applied. They flew me out, and they hired me $112 a week, which wasn't a lot back then. And again, it was really, I realized when I within a month or two, this is what I wanted to do. I didn't get along. It's the only place where I didn't get along with the editor there. And so I left or got fired, depending who you ask, and ended up staying in Michigan for 4.5 years.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, what gave you the idea to even apply for this job? You were... I was looking for work. I was just, it's not, it wasn't, I didn't have my sights set on being a journalist. Or being a writer. I needed work. I didn't want to go back to New York. Do you think it had subconsciously perhaps had something to do with your father being a famous journalist?
I'm sure if we dug deep that there's no question that he wore off on me in the best of ways.
Yeah.
He and I had a really kind of rough relationship back then. So, but there's no question. And we became really close as I got older and he got older. But yeah, there's no question that that wore off on me in ways that I don't think I was aware of at the time.
What was it like? I mean, you discussed that, or you mentioned that you had a rough relationship with him at that time, or when you were growing up. Yeah. What was I guess many of us do, but what was it?
My dad, he was a very kind of closed person. He, when I was younger, he drank a lot. But things got a lot better. I mean, he got better. I think I, eased up some, and we got really close. I mean, close enough that at some point I was showing him drafts of stories and asking for his advice. And I came to really admire him.
Well, he was a World War II vet.
He was
had a traumatic experience,
right? And that was the other thing. I'm sure he was towards the end of the war, was in France along the German border, and was in a platoon, and he was a diamond-shaped platoon, and he was at the rear, and they went up over a ridge, and when they got over the ridge, they got ambushed, and my dad was the only survivor. Wow. And he had to play dead for the entire day.
Wow.
And so he basically went crazy afterwards, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And he never, ever spoke about it. And it's interesting. So when he was in his 60s and he revisited that experience, ended up going back and finding some of the men he served with, obviously not in that platoon, and ended up writing a short memoir, this beautiful, searing memoir about war and about the toll it took on him, called Before Their Time. And I have no doubt that played a role in who he was.
Was that good for him to have written this book and finally get this kind of off his chest?
I think so. I mean, I don't, again, I mean, I'm kind of don't want to be a kind of play therapist, but there's no question about it that it had to have been helpful for him to be able to put pen to paper and tell his story. I mean, it's one of the things that stories do is they, ultimately, make us feel less alone. There's this great line at the end of Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried.
I love that book.
Oh, isn't that it's such a beautiful book. And towards the end of it, he writes, this much I know to be true, stories can save us. And I think he was speaking as much to his readers as he was to himself.
Interesting. Wow. You moved to Lansing in the 70s? Or
79.
Okay. And worked on this alternative weekly in Lansing, but then you ended up working with Michael Moore, I take it.
Yeah, so I spent 8 months at this alternative newspaper, and it was this, really profound time in Michigan and in the country, the beginning of the deindustrialization of America, and the auto industry was just reeling. And so I went and spent some time in Flint because Flint, of course, was a home to General Motors and also the birthplace of the United Auto Workers.
Right.
And it was a place that was really suffering, and Michael was running this small newspaper, the Flint Voice, and so I went up there and would crash at Michael's place and work on the paper for a week and write stories. It was a really, really troubling time for people in the heartland.
Yes.
And I ended up actually learning radio because NPR was so desperate to have somebody in Michigan to report about this. They taught me radio over the telephone.
So you were kind of
I was
kind of a loose
freelancing.
correspondent for issues related to all the layoffs and the fact that jobs are moving to Mexico and all this whole phenomena that later was the subject of Michael's first film.
Right. They were asking for all the, the GM was asking for all these givebacks from its workers. And it was an amazing time. I spent a lot of time in the union halls there. In fact, I taught at some of the union halls there. Yeah, and then Michael did his first film, Roger and Me, which was about that very era.
Is this on? Hello? Can you hear me?
We're rolling.
Hi, I'm Michael Moore. In my hometown of Flint, Michigan, General Motors closed the factories and put 30,000 people out of work. To raise their spirits, I made this movie. Fire Roger Smith! And went off to find GM Chairman Roger Smith to get some answers.
Which was really, I thought, was a turning point, not only in our understanding in some ways of these issues.
Boy, was he hard to get to.
Because he reached a much broader audience through his talents, his humor, but also a documentary that I think was kind of groundbreaking too. That it was a very unusual thing. His first film, he never made a film before.
Right. It was the antithesis of a Fred Wiseman film.
Yeah,
it was also a friend, but it was. I mean, it was where you had the filmmaker front and center, and Michael was, as he is in all of his films, was this kind of central character, and it was the beauty of that film is that, and Michael has this really, especially back then, it had this really kind of disarming quality about him. Really, really smart and incisive, and I thought this notion of trying to track down the president of General Motors was this kind of brilliant notion.
It's a great device. Yeah. What was it like to work with him on the Flint Voice?
I mean, I loved working with Michael. Again, we kind of complemented each other. I was a much more sort of deliberate, immersive reporter, and Michael had this irreverence about him and was kind of front and center, not only in his films but also in his stories. And so it was exciting. I mean, what I loved about him is he was unafraid, which is what you need to be as a journalist.
Courage.
Yeah.
Did you learn anything that you can think of from that experience of working with him? Or
well, I mean, I think one, this sense of being undaunted and unafraid. Michael was just he really lived by his convictions, and the other part of it is just to recognize that there are more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to tell a story, and so Michael there's the way that Michael does it and the way that I do it, and neither one is right or wrong or better or worse than the other. But yeah, I mean, I think more than anything, it's just this sort of power of just stand by the power of your convictions. I mean, he was really unafraid, and he was really young at the time.
Yeah. Then you ended up, did you go to the Wall Street Journal from there, or how did that all come to be?
So, I desperately wanted to work at a daily newspaper because I felt like I needed to work with some experienced reporters and editors, and I needed a job. And,
There's always that.
Yeah, and what I wanted to do is work in Detroit at the Free Press or the News, which were these really vital, robust papers at the time.
I remember those papers in those days. That was their heyday.
They was amazing places. But I couldn't get anybody to hire me because it was this catch-22 because I didn't have any daily newspaper experience.
Right.
I applied to the Nashville, Tennessee, and all these papers. And so I then decided I just wanted to be in a bigger place. And I moved to Chicago with the intention of continuing to freelance. NPR had a bureau here, so I spent a year there at the bureau. And the last place I applied to was the Wall Street Journal. And, they were willing to take a gamble.
Really? So you were in Chicago but stayed in Chicago, but got a job, a full-time gig with the Wall Street Journal.
Yeah, I was hired to cover. I thought I'd be there for maybe 2 or 3 years. I was hired to cover organized labor nationally, and then to cover these Midwest businesses like John Deere and Caterpillar.
Right.
And I quickly learned that, one, I wasn't very good at business reporting and didn't like it very much. And so I, slowly kind of carved out a niche at the paper writing about social issues. And it was actually, I think, as good a job as anybody could find in journalism. I wrote for the front page. I wrote, I could disappear for 2 or 3 months at a time. Nobody asked any questions, and I'd come back and write a story, and there it would be on the front page, and it was this incredible audience to have because I was writing for people who weren't paying any attention to these issues, and so I was writing about the projects in Chicago. I spent time writing about the farm crisis. Was still writing about organized labor around the country. And
they gave you leeway to do whatever you.
It was an amazing place to work, and it was also, it was a time at the paper. I mean, all these people who went on to have these amazing careers of writing books. Tony Horowitz, who sadly just passed away, his wife Geraldine Brooks, Jim Stewart, Brian Burrow, Eric Larson. The place was just hopping.
And you don't think of the Wall Street Journal as covering social issues primarily.
That's what I loved about it.
Surprised that when I first knew about you, I was like, he used to work for the Wall Street Journal. That doesn't make any sense.
Right. Well, there was a strong separation of church and state. So the editorial pages were and probably still are to the right of Attila the Hun, but they really trusted their reporters. And I would go out into the world and find stories, and I never ran into any interference.
That's amazing. That's great. And so I assume somewhere along the way you started to think about a book, or you had done so many stories on these kind of issues, urban poverty, the issues of race and gun violence and these kind of gang warfare, etc., the projects in Chicago. And so how did eventually the book come to be, There Are No Children Here?
Well, I knew that I realized, especially when I was at the Journal, how much I loved telling stories. And in fact, I got to know Studs Terkel early on. Early on. And Studs had recommended me to his publisher, Andre Schifrin at Pantheon. And so I remember when I hired on at the Journal, I went out to visit with Andre and over about 6 cups of coffee committed to writing a book about an industrial town in the Midwest. They had this series of books about villages that had been written. And in fact, that was Studs' Division Street was actually kind of a part of that.
Oh, it was part of that.
Yeah. Okay. And so I committed to it, and then when I came back and realized there was no way I could do that and have a full-time job, which I just had started. So that was my first sort of inclination that ultimately I'd love to sort of write books. And then, I'd done a story about Lafayette, one of the boys in There Are No Children Here, and a summer in his life. The two
brothers.
Right, in There Are No Children Here. And it was a summer in his life. I don't think I've ever gotten the kind of response I got to that book. I mean, I got hundreds of letters. It was before email, and the New York Times ran editorials, and there was all this interest in my writing a book, and I just felt like I had said everything I needed to say. And then I got a call from an agent, David Black, who's my agent to this day, who actually convinced me that there was something more here. And I think one of the things I came to realize about book writing, and it's one of the things I love about it, is also one of the things that makes me tentative about it as well, is that it's got a shelf life. And so you want to be sure that what you're writing will still feel as resonant 10 years from now as it does today. So it was while I was at the Journal that I actually took a leave of absence to write There Are No Children Here.
So you were saying you had been writing articles about these issues, but then at some point decided to take on the book,
right,
urged by your soon-to-be agent,
right,
to write a book. Tell us very briefly what that book is about for those people that haven't read, and they should read it, but if they haven't.
Yeah, I mean, it's for me, ultimately, well, I walked into Henry Horner, which was a public housing project not too far from here.
That's right.
And, it was a mile and a half from my office, which was then downtown. And I felt this incredibly deep sense of shame. Like, how is it I could not know? I mean, I thought I was pretty savvy about the poverty in our cities, and I had never, just in my short time there, just had never seen or experienced anything like it. And I thought, how is it in the world's wealthiest country people are living like this? And then that shame turned to anger. And so what I did is I ended up chronicling the 2 years in the lives of two young brothers, Lafayette and Pharaoh Rivers. They were 12 and 9 years old when I first
How did you meet them, or how did you decide to focus on?
I met Lafayette, when I worked on this Wall Street Journal piece.
Right.
But I had lost touch with him. And then I went and spent time at the Boys Club. It was now the Boys and Girls Club there, and ran into Lafayette again and met his brother Pharaoh. And one of the things I loved about the two of them is that they were both really engaging and thoughtful, and yet incredible, and loved each other, and yet incredibly different. And so I ended up spending 2 years with them writing about these two young boys growing up in the projects.
You were there, in a sense, in research mode for 2 years.
Yeah, I was there almost every day for a year and a half.
That's an amazing commitment.
Yeah.
And so I assume people just sort of got used to you being there, right?
They did. Some people didn't want to speak to me. I remember I always remember after the book came out, we were on Oprah, and it was my claim to fame in the neighborhood. And there was a woman on the third floor there when I was back visiting, and she looked out her window and wagged her finger and said, "Now I know what you were doing all this time." But when I began hanging out at the Boys Club, the head of the Boys Club, Major Adams, took me around and introduced me to a lot of the adults in the neighborhood. And one of the things he did, unbeknownst to me, was he was introducing me to some of the gang leaders and letting them know.
For safety reasons.
Yeah, just letting them know who I was and what I was doing there. I was the only, outside of the police, I was the only white person there. And so people kind of watched out for me. People always ask, did I feel unsafe? And I got to say, in all my time there, I never. There would be gunfire, and you'd sort of. But back then, it was because it was so much more deliberate. It was over the drug trade. You usually got fair warning that it was going to happen.
It wasn't as random as it seems now.
But I never had anything directed at me in all my time there.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. So you didn't feel threatened being in that
no,
housing
I was
project?
And I was careful. You crossed over Damon Avenue, the boulevard that sort of intersected the projects east and west, and it was run by a different gang, and so I wouldn't go over into that part of the projects unless I had an escort.
And what were you trying to do? You decided to focus on these two brothers, and what was your goal? What was your aim? Using them as a microcosm, or what was your thinking?
I just wanted to tell the story of this part of this sliver of America that had been completely ignored and neglected. People who were growing up in this profound poverty in our country, and I think there's this myth out there that people are in the position they are because of choices they've made or who they are. And I wanted to try to, in some ways, pop that myth. And so the book, it follows these two boys. It talks about the history of the neighborhood, the kind of deliberate effort to sort of keep all these very poor people in a very constrained neighborhood. There were a number of them in the city. The history of public housing, about how fraught that was, about how it really served as a kind of bulwark to segregation in the city. And it was just really an effort to sort of understand through the eyes of these two boys about all the pressures and forces bearing down on them, of which they had no responsibility for.
And the title I guess in some ways sums it up. I mean, they're because of the violence and the poverty that they're enmeshed in, that they aren't really children in a way that.
Right. It was a line when I asked their mother whether it would be okay for me to do the book and to spend time with her family and her children. Her response, she kind of got it right away. She understood. I mean, the conditions there were just horrific, and people needed to know. And she said to me, I told her I wanted to write specifically about children, and she said to me, but there are no children here. And of course, the irony, of course, is that they are in fact kids.
Right, of course.
But they're not given the sort of space in the room to have the kind of childhoods that most of us experience.
Right. And I love the book and also your new book, because doesn't come off as preachy or don't have an agenda. You're not trying to change policy. You're telling stories with great empathy, I think, and great descriptive powers that allow us into this world, as you described earlier, that we wouldn't normally be in. And I think to me, it's a deeper experience to be able to be in that world as you describe, in the storytelling approach, as opposed to other books I've read, which some are very important books, but they're very prescriptive.
Right.
So I really admire.
Right. Well, thanks. And the thing I always say about telling stories is, you tell stories not to answer questions, but to ask them.
Right.
And,
very important point.
Yeah.
And Farrow and Lafayette, so they stayed with you. Didn't you adopt one of the?
I didn't adopt him, and I'll talk about it as much as I talked about it in American Summer. But he came to live with us for 6 years from the age of 12 to 18. And it was, he was a kid who absolutely loved school. Mm-hmm. And after the book came out, he was having trouble, not unrelated to the book, but I helped get him into a college prep school in the West Side, Providence, St. Mel.
Oh yeah,
and he was
famous school.
Yeah, I mean, a terrific place. And he was having trouble concentrating, doing his homework. And I was living up on the North Side, and I was single at the time. And he asked if he could move in with me for a week or two to just.
And a week or two became a couple of years.
Became 6 years.
6 years.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I remember in the new book there's a little intro about discussing that, and it's important, I think, as you've said in other interviews, you've developed relationships with these people, so you've stayed in touch with them, I assume.
Right. No, Farrow and Lafayette. I mean, I just talked to them yesterday. They're now in their 40s.
Are they really?
Yeah. Yeah. So I know. Time.
Wow.
I know.
That's
time was
crazy.
And so they've become very much a part of my life. And it's one of the things I love about my work is a lot of the people, not everybody, but a lot of the people I meet while I'm reporting, become a part of my life and my family's life, and I feel my life is so much richer and fuller.
Yeah,
for that.
it enriches your life, I think, Obviously, that book, There Are No Children Here, became a phenomena, really. It was a landmark book, and it really became a bestseller, and it was eventually turned into a movie by Oprah Winfrey, and it won a bunch of awards, and I imagine it must have changed your life. What was it like to suddenly have this kind of phenomena that you had created?
Yeah, I was probably too young to enjoy it at the time, but it was a heady experience. I mean, listen, I had never written a book before, so I didn't know what to expect.
That's right.
And I felt like I had written the book I wanted to write, and I'm not sure that my publisher or I had great expectations, but as you say, the book sort of took off in ways I hadn't imagined. And one of the things I love about the book is I still hear from readers. In fact, I just got emails this morning from readers of There Are No Children Here.
All these many years later.
Yeah, I mean, students in a high school, it's used a lot in high schools and colleges. And the two things that I've loved, I mean, one which I had hoped for is I get these letters like I got from these kids from Muskegon in Michigan this morning about how it really got them thinking about the world, about this country differently. It sort of made them realize that in some ways how privileged their lives are, and also what other people are up against. But the other part that I didn't expect is I hear from people too who just say, "Thank you for telling my story." People who grew up in similar communities or circumstances, and sort of see some of themselves in Lafayette.
Nobody had ever told their story before in some ways.
Yeah. Right. So it's been incredibly rewarding, and just on a practical note, one of the things it did is it made it easier for me to continue writing what I wanted to write about.
Right. It was kind of a liberating in that way too.
Yeah.
That's great. You talked very briefly, but your second book was The Other Side of the River, and it's set in the intersection of St. Joseph, Michigan, and
and Benton Harbor.
Benton Harbor and St. Joseph. And I from Michigan, as you know, so I'm well aware. I've been to those towns, both those towns. There's a river, the St. Joe River, that runs between them.
Right.
And this is a case where a young African-American boy was found drowned in the river, and it's quite an amazing tale. It's kind of a detective story, but also, of course, a story about race.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, it came very much out of There Are No Children Here, because I realized that after the book came out and I would go around the country talking about the book, that one of the things the book didn't do in a really forthright way is talk about race.
Right.
And so I wanted to, and at the time, I think things are different today. The thing that for me was most notable about the conversation around race in this country was its absence. There was just really no conversation.
Right.
And so as a storyteller, man, that's hard to do, is to write about something that just doesn't exist.
Right.
And so it was right after the Rodney King verdict had been rendered.
Around 92 then, basically.
92, 93,
Yeah,
right. And the
yeah.
verdict had been rendered, and L.A. went up
That's
in
right.
flames.
Ended early Sunday morning with the motorist, a black male, being brutally beaten and kicked by Los Angeles police officers. A beating that continued even as the man appeared to offer no resistance.
All of a sudden, police brutality had a human face, and it was being battered by Los Angeles cops on a neighborhood street in the San Fernando Valley.
The motorist was apparently shot by a taser gun, which is used to electrically shock a suspect into submission. But police also stomped on the man's head and repeatedly kicked him before both his wrists and ankles were bound.
And I was at the Wall Street Journal at the time, and they wanted me to go to Los Angeles.
Oh,
and I don't like
cover
being
that.
and I don't like being in the center of the storm. I don't like the competition. And I
Right.
said, let me see if I can find a story that would help us reflect on what's going on out there. And I knew Benton Harbor and St. Joe from my time in Michigan.
Right.
And you know, for me, it's kind of a metaphor for this country. You've got
Yeah.
these two small towns, one
And the river.
black, one white, one desperately poor, one very prosperous, separated by this river. You know, and again, if it's not a river, it's railroad tracks or a boulevard.
Dan Ryan Expressway.
Right, or Austin Avenue where
That's
I live.
right.
Yeah, and so I went up there and I went to the library, and the librarian asked me what I was doing, and I told her, and she began to tell me the story of this young boy, Eric McGinnis, who a year earlier had been grew up in Benton Harbor, lived in Benton Harbor, was in St. Joe, which was kind of unusual for the night hang. He had some white friends, and allegedly had broken into a car and got caught and was chased, and then 3 days later his body was found floating in the river. And what was clear to me is that virtually everybody in Benton Harbor in the black community was convinced that Eric had died as a result of foul play because he had been dating a white girl, which in fact he had. And everybody in St. Joe, the white town, was convinced that Eric had died an accidental death, that he had tried to swim the river to get home, as kind of Rashomon of race. You know, just like Rodney King, when you looked at that videotape, I don't know if you remember, but
Yes.
depending on sort of where your
right.
perspective, your personal and collective history, you came to that videotape with very different
So it was
conclusions.
in a way, it was a perfect metaphor
Right.
for the racial divide in this country.
Right. So that's why I ended up there. Is
Yeah.
that for me, it was right. It was this perfect metaphor for what we were reckoning with. And of course, the two towns were forced to talk about race because of this crisis at hand, which was so much the case back then. And then, of course, while I was writing the book, we had the O.J. Simpson trial.
That's right.
You know.
That's right. And things have, in some ways, have changed quite a bit. I mean, now I do believe we are finally having a dialogue about race. It's not always the most productive
Right.
dialogue, but we are at least doing that, which, as you said, in those days was not as prevalent.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're having a dialogue about it now, but I think it's certainly out in the open.
Yeah,
in a way that
maybe
hasn't been.
dialogue is not the right word.
I wish we were having a
I
dialogue.
wish we were,
yeah.
yes. So you also then, many years later, got involved with your friend Steve James on a documentary called The Interrupters.
Well, it was a violent night in Chicago. 9 people were shot in just 5 hours. 1 person died.
Gregory Robinson is the 28th Chicago public school student killed this school year. Died last night.
Killed so far this year. Among number of Americans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Another sign of the times, members of Ceasefire were also at today's memorial service, hoping to stop any thoughts of retaliation for Greg's murder.
12, 13-year-olds are walking around with bulletproof vests on up under their clothes.
I'd written a story for the New York Times Magazine about this organization, Ceasefire, and I was really drawn not so much to the organization itself, but to some of the people who work there. These men and women who were in their 40s, 50s, some of them in their 30s.
The interrupters.
Right, all formerly of the street, who for one reason or another had this second act in life and were trying to undo some of the damage that they had helped cause when they were younger. And I was telling Steve after the story came out, I said, why don't you come with me to one of these? They would meet every Wednesday, and why don't you come to one of these meetings? You just look in their faces, and you can see the kind of history there, the sort of the pain that they've experienced, and we ended up. Following 3 of the interrupters over the course of 14 months. I mean, the fine line we walked with this film is that we really didn't see it as a film about ceasefire per se, but really sort of we're using these 3 individuals to sort of be our eyes and ears in these communities to help us kind of understand and what was taking place and understand the violence. And it was an extraordinary experience. I mean, we ended up with 3 remarkable people.
A man was murdered overnight on Chicago's South Side. Police say it happened execution.
On the streets of Chicago.
Youth violence in Chicago has gotten world attention.
We got over 500 years of prison time at this table. That's a lot of wisdom.
Ex-gang members recruited to stop the violence.
The violence interrupters had one goal in mind: save a life.
Kobe.
How can you help me right now?
Kobe has big-time credibility with the gang members out there.
Eddie.
Half of my life I was in prison. That's why I do what I do now.
You good with son?
Amina.
Amina Matthews' father was one of the biggest gang leaders in the history of Chicago. She gets in where a lot of guys can't get in.
So the life that I lived, being in shootouts, looking at the devil face to face, and I look at my sisters and my brothers today, that was once me.
A window into a world that few of us would ever meet. Was there danger? Did you ever feel a sense of danger going out there?
No, the answer is no, because this is one of the beauties of working on that particular film, is we had these 3 guides, Kobe, Eddie, and Amina, who were watching our back all the time.
Okay.
And they had so much respect in the neighborhoods where they were. Kobe used to introduce us as, he'd say, this is my film crew. That was
my personal film crew.
It was,
Doesn't everybody have one?
I always wanted to be like my dad. He is my role model, because he used to always dress slick, wear big hats and suits and, all that. And I just, want to be like him. I was 11 years old when my father got killed. He got beat with some baseball bats. And that just messed me up. I used to be out there in the streets all through the night. I used to be in jails, fighting, kicking off rides, and doing all crazy stuff. Just gang banging.
Oh, what up, boy? Man, come holler at me, man. What's up?
Ricardo Kobe Williams. He's a younger interrupter, which is a good thing. But once he came on board at Ceasefire, he began to really turn the heat on. Kobe knows how to get in. He talks the language. And he knows what to say, when to say it.
Crazy, man. You 2 guys, man, y'all been around here on a lot of bullshit, both of y'all.
Robbing people, breaking their windows.
Go wait for eat for kind of us. Break it out, look at them.
And we also made we wanted as much access as we could get. So we made an arrangement with the 3 of them that, in the end we would show them a rough cut, not for obviously retaining editorial, but partly so that there'd be no moments that might compromise them or anybody else.
Right,
and in fact, there was a scene that we ended up removing from the film because of concerns about the safety of one of the people in the scene.
Right.
But yeah, it was it was a wonderful experience. I loved working with Steve, and we also had another co-producer on, Zach Piper, and I just it was the 3 of us. It was a
great
really
team.
It was a really
bare
small
bones team.
It was right. It was a really small crew. There were never more than 3 of us. Often just 2.
Steve told me that he kept the camera right by his door.
Yeah, right.
It just, as you said, as a moment's notice, he would have to fly out to the west side and film.
We'd be on the phone at 1 o'clock in the morning. Just got a call from Kobe. What do you think? Should we go out?
Wow.
And we'd have to make these. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's why the film is such a incredible. One of the reasons it's so incredible is you're always there at these moments.
And it was inspiring. I mean, and plus for me, I mean, I've done some film before. One, it was a real treat to work with somebody of Steve's immense talents.
Yes.
I mean, I really learned a lot. And there was something about the collaborative experience that I just really enjoyed because I spent so much time working by myself.
That's right. What was that like for you to collaborate with somebody and to work in a different medium? What's different about it and what's the same?
Right. Well, I mean, the thing about film, of course, I mean, as you well know, is that so much of it, you've got to be there in the moment.
Yes.
And it's really, I mean, it's where, in some ways, print trumps film, is I can go back and on the page and recreate moments with the same cinematic quality as I could if I were present for it. But with film, you really got to be there.
That's
so
right.
we were, on call 24 hours a day. We, would get calls late at night and would have to make some quick decisions about whether to go out. And you sort of have to be operating for film to work. You got to be operating on all cylinders. You know, you've got to and so for me, and again, I'd done some documentary work before. It wasn't my first experience. I think with this, one of the things that I realized, we would go into the edit room, and I would go in there, having just been in there the day before, 2 days earlier, and I had trouble holding it all in my head. I'd go down, we'd be watching a scene, and I had to be kind of reminded of what preceded it and what followed. But like if I'm working on a book, it's like all in my head. I mean, it might just be the way I'm wired. And yet Steve could go down there, and we would edit in his basement, and he had it all clearly in his head. He
was wired differently from you. He could figure out what the scenes were preceding and.
Right. And there's something. One of the beauties about film is it's so accessible.
Yes. Yeah, I mean the film reached a huge audience, as I recall, won a lot of awards, and really had a big impact on people. Again, you were also a correspondent and one of the producers of this really great series on This American Life about Harper High School in Chicago. I wonder if you could talk about that. That was an incredible series that you did with, I believe, with Linda Lutton
and Ben Calhoun.
Right. And talk about that.
Sure.
That
project.
So
I've been doing. I mean, I've known Ira for years, and so I've been doing stuff for the show.
Let's mention that Ira Glass is the founder of This American Life.
Right. So I've been doing stuff for them from the very beginning. Ira has changed the landscape for storytelling, and that show, I love doing stories for that show. I mean, it's got some of the smartest, most incisive producers. I had gotten a call from Julie Snyder, who was basically the managing editor for the show, and she now was the co-founder of Serial.
Okay.
But Julie, they were trying to figure out whether there was a really difficult spring here in the city, and we had a really bad Memorial Day, and she was trying to figure out whether there might be a story to do around Memorial Day weekend, and was asking for advice, and I was talking to her about it. I just said I didn't think that was necessarily a great idea because my concern is that because it was so recent, it would be really hard to get people to talk to us. And then I heard this piece by Linda Lutton, a reporter at WBZ, an education reporter, and it was a really kind of small story, but really really compelling and in some ways really profound. But she was at a funeral for a student at Harper High, Shikaki Asfi, and she was with the principal, Leonetta Sanders, and they had lost so many kids the year before that Miss Sanders had started to keep a notebook of all the kids, both current and former students.
It was that many kids.
They had 27 current and former students who had been shot that year, 7 of them fatally. And so she had this notebook.
And this is a woman who's at Harper High School.
She was the principal.
Okay.
And so I sent the piece to Julie, and I called Linda, and I just wondered whether, given that the school year was about to begin, whether it made sense to kind of plant ourselves in this school and try to sort of understand how this institution tries to regain its footing after this horrible year. And so Linda and myself and Ben went out there on that first day, and not sure how we were going to pull this all together. In the 5 months I spent at Harper, nearly every time I visited the school's social work office, which was often, Thomas, a junior, would be there too, during classes, passing periods, lunch, whenever. So much that one day I asked him, "Hey, every time I come here, you're here. Why do you hang out here so much?"
Dang, I ain't gonna give you no answer for that. Every time I come, you come in there for real.
No, every time I come, you're here.
Sometimes I just need to talk to somebody. That's why I come in here.
Thomas has witnessed an incredible amount of violence. Last June, he was standing on the porch of an abandoned building talking with another Harper student, Shikaki Aspie, when she was shot and killed. This, though, wasn't the first murder Thomas had witnessed. Back in 2006, he was at a birthday party for 10-year-old girl Saritha White, nicknamed Nugget, when someone shot through the front window. Thomas says he remembers being led out of the house by the police and seeing Nugget laying on the floor with what appeared to be her brains next to her. Nugget's killing happened when Thomas was 10. Shikaki's murder was when Thomas was 17. And as his social worker Anita Stewart tells it, there have been many, many in between.
Last summer he did witness, one of the kids in the neighborhood got shot in the face. He witnessed that. Then it was a student here that got shot in the leg. He was a witness to that.
I was very fortunate. I met these two social workers who I just fell in love with, and I just disappeared. I embedded with them, and that was my place in the school.
Good morning, Thomas. Good morning. And I can't understand why you didn't get here on time this morning. You know that your sister says that she wakes you up every morning.
My mama just brought me here.
Lower your voice. I'm right here. It's so good to see you this morning.
Why you just come time out?
Thomas and Anita have an interesting relationship. He's pretty combative, kind of churlish. At times, it almost seems like he doesn't even like Anita very much. But the truth is, they're incredibly close. I don't think Thomas opens up much to many people, but he does with Anita. At the end of October, on the first floor, the school put up a memorial display for Shikaki, the girl Thomas was standing next to when she was killed. Anita had worked with Shikaki for 2 years, and she's still struggling with her own grief over her death. And partly, it's this shared grief that draws Anita and Thomas together. Like Thomas, Anita hasn't been able to bring herself to look at the memorial.
So why haven't you gone up there to look at it?
If I think about it, I'll do something.
You'll do something like what?
Try to hurt somebody.
Try to hurt somebody, he says. Trying to hurt someone or wanting to hurt someone, these are things Thomas has said a lot. One time when I asked him where he thought he might be in 10 years, he said, might be in jail because I think I'm going to hurt someone. Mostly it felt like tough talk, like teenage bravado. But on this day, when talking about Shikaki, it started to become clear that this kind of talk about hurting someone, isn't just tough guy bragging. I began to realize that Thomas was trying the best he could to be honest about some feelings he has, feelings that scare him.
And you were there for the whole school year?
We were there for 6 months.
6 months,
yeah.
okay.
And not every day. We were there, at the beginning more
Right.
often than we were towards the end. But
I mean, it has because of the length of it,
Right.
it has this amazing depth
Right.
of understanding of all the nuances of that school. Instead of just parachuting in,
Right.
You were there, kind of embedded, as you said.
We heard one of the school's two social workers, Anita Stewart, earlier this hour. Crystal Smith is the other one. Crystal is relentlessly bright, positive, cheerful, peppy, like aggressively so. Here's how early in the year she says goodbye to a kid in her office who is leaving for class.
Hello, you are a person, okay? You are valuable and you matter. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Okay, go.
By late November this year, though, things have kind of changed. Alex explains how.
It's the Tuesday before Thanksgiving break, and I run into Crystal Smith, who's just coming into work. She collapses into her chair. Crystal tells me that last night she went to the ER. She was worried she was having a stroke, but the doctor told her it was most likely symptoms of stress. But Crystal isn't just having a bad day. Work has been wearing her down, and others, it seems, are having a hard time too. It's not over, they said. Yeah, there haven't been any students killed this year, but the shooting hasn't stopped. I point out that that's how the kids must feel sometimes, and they agree. In the office, I tell Crystal that she looks tired.
Yeah, I know. I don't know, maybe your book stressed me out.
Crystal's been working towards a second master's degree, and in one of her classes this year has been reading a book I wrote over 20 years ago called There Are No Children Here, where I follow two brothers living in the projects on Chicago's west side. For a couple of years, I followed the boys as they grappled with violence, poverty, and the gangs, and Crystal wonders if reading it isn't adding to her stress.
It was really interesting, though, to think that 20 years later, nothing has changed. That's the scarier part.
You mean in the neighborhoods?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You know that the same cycles are being repeated over again.
One of the things that's stressing Crystal out is her relationship with a junior named Devante. Earlier in the year, Crystal began meeting regularly with Devante. Last February, Devante accidentally shot and killed his 14-year-old brother. Since then, his sister has stopped talking to him, and things have been strained with his mom.
I started getting along with Miss Smith like during sophomore year or something like that. And she started loving me.
I think she's really fond of you. She worries about you.
All the time.
Do you like it that she worries about you?
Yeah, I like for a person that cares for me and stuff.
I started to ask Devante a bit about his brother and about the accident, but he told me that he didn't really want to talk about it.
I be wanting to give up on my life sometimes.
Is that right, Devante? Why?
I don't like my life no more. I hate myself.
I lost him. And, like, how could I lose him when, I'm reaching my hand out, grab back?
A few days later, Crystal calls Devante. She then runs through what for them has by now become a familiar exercise. When you look in the mirror, what do you see? Crystal asks. The good Devante, he replies. Then Crystal reminds him, don't forget he's in there.
And so that was it was very hard for me. And I said, okay, son, I love you and take care of yourself. He said, I love you too, Ma. And I hung up. That's that.
I mean, it was both difficult and it was also a real treat.
Alex Kotlowitz.
Got you out of your isolation
exactly.
booth for a while.
Yeah.
That series went on to win a Peabody Award, as I recall, and really was, I think it was a very profound, and Harper, of course, is an infamous school in many ways in terms of the violence around it.
Right.
So,
and then Michelle Obama came out to visit the school, and she writes about it in her book.
That's right. Yeah. So you have a brand new book. Well, it's not brand new, but it's been out for a few months. An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. And it kind of, in a way, thematically revisits some of the themes of your first book, but also is obviously very different. Why did you want to write this book, and how did it come to be?
Yeah. So I was grappling, I'd done this Harper High series. I'd done The Interrupters with Steve.
Mm-hmm.
I still kind of wrestling with the violence in our city. And again, I could have written this book in so many different places: Philadelphia, Kansas, Kansas City, St. Louis, New Orleans. I happen to be in Chicago, and this is my home. And so to try to sort of understand, I've long felt that we have completely underestimated the impact of the violence on both the spirit of individuals and the spirit of communities. And so I wanted to write as intimate a book as I could about what the violence does to people and to community. And a friend of mine, Dave Isay, who founded StoryCorps,
That's right.
We were in New York and at a benefit together, and we were talking about what I was thinking about doing next, and I was still a little lost. I remember I got this excited call from Dave, though every call hit from his an excited call, and he said, I've got an idea, you just need to spend one summer and write about one summer. And I thought, well, that sounds great, in part because I thought, I can get the reporting done reasonably quickly. I can just spend the summer and maybe another 6 months and then write. And of course, that turned into 6 years. But but so I took this summer, this fairly random summer,
and it was the summer of 2013.
2013.
13, right?
I was looking, I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted it to be this kind of collection of stories. That there was no way to capture the impact of the violence by writing about one particular story.
So different from There Are No Children Here, this is a collection of stories of numerous characters,
right?
And you revisit them throughout the book.
Right. Some of the stories course through the summer.
Course through the whole summer, right?
And I was looking for stories that upended what I thought I knew. Stories that surprised me.
What's one story that surprised you the most?
Well, I wouldn't say there's one story that surprised me most, but there are stories in the book that they've all stayed with me. But there's a story of Lisa Daniels, who's towards the very beginning. Lisa's again this extraordinary individual, and her son Darren Easterling, who was 25 years old, was shot and killed in a drug deal gone awry.
Right.
And I don't want to give the whole story away, but one of the things that's kind of remarkable about her story is she ends up forgiving the person who killed her son.
Right, and they have a relationship, as I recall.
Yeah,
or at least
they had a correspondence when he was in prison.
Right.
And it's this story about grief, about mourning, about moving on, and about forgiveness.
Yeah. Forgiveness in a very extreme situation.
Right. And there are other stories in the book. So hers is about forgiving someone else. And then there are these couple of stories, the story of Eddie Bocanegra and of Marcelo Sanchez about trying to forgive yourself for what you've done.
Well, it's an amazing book. One of the things I noted about it was it's an amazing job of very quickly describing the characters, getting us right into knowing who they are. I wanted to just, if you don't mind, I wanted to read one quick description.
Sure, yeah.
There's a character named Ashara Muhammad.
Oh, yeah.
And she's a very distinctive character, at least in my view, reading the book. Here's a description that Alex wrote about her. Ashara, who's 26 and striking, has big expressive eyes which hide little. She rolls them when annoyed. They widen when she gets excited. She closes them when she wants to disappear. By her own admission, she's also loud. She likes to talk, to tell stories, to offer her opinion, to reflect, to ask questions. She's a turbine of energy in a rather small, petite body. And to me, it's like I can see her. And you do that throughout the book. Very spare in a way, but just hitting the right notes of describing. So when these people are presented each time, I feel like, because I'm a filmmaker, maybe I can just picture these people.
It's funny.
It's really interesting.
It's funny. I just saw Eddie Bocanegra the other day, who's one of the characters in the book, and I had gotten an email from a woman in St. Louis who told me she was reading the book and was in the middle of Eddie's chapter, and she said, "I can't read on unless you tell me that he makes it." So I wrote her back and I said, "Yeah, not only does he make it, but he's moving forward in this kind of heroic fashion." So she ended up finishing the book. She contacted Eddie, and she came to Chicago to meet him to actually donate money to his violence prevention effort. But the thing she said to Eddie, she said, "You look exactly like I thought you would look."
From the description.
Yeah, right. So I thought it. But and Ashara is this amazing woman. She actually, in fact, lives in Philadelphia now. She's actually working on this incredible documentary film now about black manhood.
Wow.
She's
well, it's a fantastic story because she has a friend named Ari Sanders who was involved in a kind of a bungled, terrible incident where a kid was killed. And he obviously went to prison for a while, but it's their conversations or their emails back and forth that are fascinating because they both learn so much, not only about each other because they were childhood friends, but about themselves.
I know
really amazing.
Those letters, the correspondence between the two of them, each of them in their own way, you realize is kind of pulling back this mask in some ways and learning so much about themselves and about each other.
Yeah, I loved it. It was very. It was so honest.
Right. Two really smart,
amazing.
Wise, and honest people.
Yeah. You don't see that kind of raw honesty that often, I don't think. But the book is, of course, is a difficult book to read for anybody, but it's also, I found it to be, at times, triumphant and affirming, complicated, messy. All those things at once. It was a fascinating look at this this issue of this gun violence that's racking Chicago and many other cities.
Well, I love it that you saw that in there, because I think it is really difficult, painful terrain.
Yes,
but you're right, there is something incredibly, triumphant is a great way to think about it. There's something really triumphant about some of, if not many of the stories in the book.
What they have gone through to overcome that pain, or like to be able to forgive themselves or whatever. It's really amazing. But I know it must have been difficult for you, taking nothing away from their trauma, which is, of course, devastating. But just a question for you is, what was it like for you to write about such a difficult subject?
So it's always difficult for me to talk about, because I feel a little, in some ways, a little sheepish, because it feels so small, given what the people I met have been through.
Right.
And it became clear in writing the book is that some of the people I was writing about, like a newspaper reporter, Pete Nikias, and the social worker, Anita Stewart, were experiencing this kind of vicarious or secondary trauma, not because of anything they had personally witnessed, but because of all the stories they were hearing.
Right.
And when I had finished the bulk of the reporting, I went through this kind of really deep depression, unlike anything I've ever experienced before. And I wasn't kind of self-aware enough to realize what was going on, but I realized in hindsight, I went into therapy, I needed to, was that it had so much to do with all these stories that I had digested over the course of the previous few years. For me, the great catharsis I had, of course, is I was able to take pen to paper and tell these stories.
Right.
And there's something really empowering about
like your father had done many years earlier,
about his
to get it out on paper is cathartic. Right. Wow. It's a brave book to have taken on. And I, again, don't mean to take anything away from the trauma that they experienced, but for you as well, it's difficult. But I'm so glad you wrote this book, because, again, it gives us an insight. All we hear about is, this person was killed in a shootout or this and that, and we don't know who these people are.
Right, and more often than not, you read stories that it was gang related, suggesting that the victim kind of got their due, or what goes around comes around, or we just have these stories or headlines of numbers, like we're in a pennant race, and we kind of forget about these individuals.
I want privacy 18. You know what I'm saying? Because I'm a gangbanger. I ain't gonna lie. I'm gonna keep it real with you.
Silas Ratcliffe and Maurice Childress are both 16. Both are associated with a gang and say they wouldn't be surprised if they were shot today.
Just walking down the street, you never know. Walking down the street, you never know. It just be your time to go. Right. You always gotta look behind, turn your back. Bullets ain't got no name. They might want to kill me, and then they end up killing you, and not killing me.
The kids are matter of fact about the things they do and what they've seen.
I've seen people get shot, killed, robbed, stabbed. I've done some of that, all that. It's just crazy.
According to Chicago police, the murder rate here is up 35% compared to last year. People living here say the gangs have taken over. Some say they'd like to see the National Guard come in.
We need help. You need help. That's the only way I can put it.
Maurice and Silas say there are no jobs and people have no idea how hard it is to survive.
Also, to recognize that it doesn't go away. It's not, you lose a loved one. It's not like a week from now you're walking around and beginning to experience all this joy again.
Right.
And you've got to, the other thing about it is, unlike veterans returning from combat, you got to look over your shoulder and worry about what's going to happen next.
That's right, all the time in those neighborhoods. So what has been the reaction to this book that you've experienced?
Some people, it's been really terrific. I get, notes and letters. In fact, I just got a couple of emails this morning just about sort of getting people to, that they say they now are thinking differently about these communities, these neighborhoods, these people. It has upended what they thought they knew, which is wonderful. It is dark terrain. I recognize that, and I kind of and I sometimes hear that from people. That's a painful book. People tell me they cry a lot, but again, it's funny because I feel there is something incredibly triumphant about so many of the stories in the book, and you walk away from it and you can see the light there. And I've also heard from policymakers. I hope that the book will help, as stories often do, will inform the way we think about public policy.
I know that in the New York Times review, I think they completely didn't get this book at all. In fact, I think I had sent you an email about this, saying that this should have been a book about, I don't know, policy or prescriptions or something. And I was like, who wrote this? I mean, they don't get this book at all. This is a story of people that are facing this trauma. It's not a book. It's not ever intended, I don't assume, to be a policy analysis or anything like that.
Right. And the truth of the matter is, sadly, we don't know what works. And that's what we're trying to grapple with at the moment. Right. And so anybody who tells you differently, I think, is lying. I mean, just look at the numbers.
Yeah. I mean, it is, if you were to, again, I'm not asking you to be a policy person, but I mean, from observing this for all these years, this violence, the poverty, the neglect, everything that's happening in the west side and the south side of Chicago. What do you think, what are your observations for, not so much how we can solve the problem, but what contributes, what are the factors that...
Well, I think directly dealing with the violence, I think we've got to really begin to grapple with the trauma, especially, of young people coming out of these communities. We have not in any way begun to acknowledge the trauma that people have experienced. And one of the consequences of that is that people feel utterly alone. They feel that nobody can possibly understand what they're going through, or there's something flawed about their character. So there's that part. I think also, too, it's really important as institutions in the city, schools, the police in particular, need to look inward and sort of ask themselves about what they might be doing differently. Like, it kind of drives me crazy at the moment with our police department that for them, every time we have a violent weekend, it's all about the sort of inability to hold gun offenders accountable. And I want to say maybe that's a conversation we should be having, but why not ask yourself what you should be doing differently? So, for example, one of the things about the police department is they have notoriously low closure rates when it comes to murders and shootings.
Right.
And so,
and by that you mean they're not finding the culprits.
No, in fact, the closure rate for murders is roughly 20% in the city. For shootings, it's around 10%. And the other part, the sort of larger and more profound question, is how do we galvanize the political place to really begin to rebuild these neighborhoods and communities. I mean, the thing for me that's most sobering, it's been almost 30 years between this book and There Are No Children Here.
Right.
In some ways, is how little things have changed in these neighborhoods.
Sad.
Yeah. And these are communities that are still reeling from the 2008 housing crisis.
Right.
And so the question I have is, where's everybody been?
Yeah. And they've lost so much population over the years.
Right, and you lose a sense of hope. You walk out of your home in Englewood on the south side, and you look at the beautiful skyline downtown. I think one of the most beautiful skylines in the world, and you know what's not yours.
Right, and not even approachable, really. Yeah. Well, it's been just a great conversation, Alex. Thank you so much for coming in, and the book is in my opinion, is profound. It's a tremendous a way to understand this world. It's called An American Summer, Love and Death in Chicago. Alex Kotlowitz, thank you for coming on the
Bob,
show today.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah, thanks.
Great to talk to you.
Join us next time when we hear from the dynamic musician and visual artist, John Langford. He is one of the founders of punk band The Mekons, post-punk group The Three Johns, and alternative country ensembles The Waco Brothers and Pine Valley Cosmonauts. He has also contributed his talents to the popular radio podcast This American Life with Ira Glass. And John gives us a preview of his new song about our current president. You don't want to miss this. And if you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe, leave us a rating and review so more people can hear about us, and share about Rhythm of Life on social media and like us on Facebook. Thanks for listening. I'm Steve This has been a Rhythm and Light production.